This is the Prevalent Risk Governance Podcast, featuring conversations with today's top C-suite executives and practitioners who not only look at third-party risk governance, but push through the boundaries to protect data. Now, here's Prevalent CEO Jonathan Dambrot and third-party evangelist Brenda Ferraro.
This week, Jonathan and I are excited to welcome Dr. Ed Amoroso, who is the Chief Executive Officer at Tag Cyber LLC. Ed is a well-known global security advisor, and he supports hundreds of companies across the world. He recently retired from AT&T after 31 years of service. In this candid interview, we will hear about 2018 risk focus related to third-party risk governance on cloud security, IoT, and application security. Ed, thanks for being on the show.
Thanks for having me.
So the first thing that I would like to know from you is pertaining to third-party risk, what's been missing in 2017 from the cloud security space that we really need to heavily address in 2018?
Well, that's a great question. You know, there's a lot of confusion around cloud and third-party, as I think you know. You know, there's this perception that when you take your data and you push it out into the cloud, that it's going off into this black box where you just have absolutely no clue what the data operations are or the business processes or the security infrastructure. And that's just not right. I mean, we've come a long way in our third-party cloud infrastructure and available services. And there's a lot of overlay things that one can do. You can microsegment, you can put CASBs in place, and you can also query your cloud provider. Most of the bigger ones now offer all kinds of native tools for alarming on different conditions and so on and so forth. You can hook them up into your SIM. So I think we're sort of at a transition now where, you know, a lot of the curmudgeons years ago would say, absolutely not using cloud, you know, keep everything inside the perimeter. I think they recognize the two main shifts. Number one, the perimeters haven't worked out too well. So you know, that's if the perimeter was working great, maybe we'd have a little bit more motivation to keep things inside. But second, I think that the cloud services have just gotten better, and there's a lot more capabilities that one can rely on to protect data. So I think there's a very clear shift towards shared services, third party, and definitely cloud. I hope that makes sense.
It does. One of the concerns that I have from an assessment perspective is in the cloud space, you either have like a bunch of information that you have to gather, or if they're using Amazon Web Services, getting the information from those big conglomerates to make sure that they have security in place for the different packages that they offer. Do you have any advice for us on, you know, how deep or in-depth do we need to go when we're doing assessments from company to company to make sure that the information is secure?
Well, you know, it really does vary. Some companies have a team that sits in some sense as the account provisioning intermediaries. They keep track of all that and make sure the accounts are set up properly and that everybody has the right bells and whistles put in place. And, you know, and the risk management activities can typically be done through that intermediary group. They usually call themselves cloud and data security or something. They'll report to the CISO, and that's all pretty tidy. But at the other end of the spectrum, you have organizations, and this is very typical in tech companies, where you have a lot of people who want to go off and do R&D and are using cloud, where the cloud infrastructure is accessed in a very ad hoc manner. It's scattered, it's random. And they would argue, by the way, that that's the whole point, right? I mean, the whole idea of cloud is its ubiquity, its availability. But then to do risk management around that sort of thing is kind of a mess, right? Because you have, you know, lots of redundancy, lots of accounts scattered all over the place. And you're not entirely sure whether people have the right kinds of utilities turned on. Like if they're using Amazon or something, then they should be alarming on conditions. And, you know, if it's more ad hoc, then you have to rely on people to follow business process. So there's a whole spectrum, which is not atypical when we're going through transformations and transitions in our industry, going from, you know, let's face it, companies that maybe not doing as much cloud a few years ago to a place in the next few years where I think it becomes the predominant means for computing. Certainly in small and middle-sized business, I think the larger companies will be a little bit more gradual in the evolution, but I think eventually it becomes the predominant means for computing.
So Ed, just tagging onto that, when you think about some of the cloud providers, and let's say there's 5 or 6 that have become really the key leaders from a cloud perspective, do you think looking at 2018, we start looking at things like concentration risk? Has that become something, if all of your third and fourth parties and everybody downstream are all using these, let's say 5 or 6, including potentially some of the cloud, I think you used to work with a leading cloud provider company as well. Like, do you think that becomes a major issue next year and the year after, as all of our data, a lot of our computing is all happening in a central location, and it could be happening even with the partners that we select?
Well, that could be, and you know a lot about third-party risk. You know as much about it as anyone I know. So this issue of putting all your eggs in one basket versus scattering all your eggs, that's a question that board members would certainly ask. One thing I would tell you that might be interesting to consider in the context of your question is that a bunch of years ago, when people moved from traditional circuit switch networking to IP networking with a handful of tier 1 carriers, what they were doing was essentially concentrating their network into a couple of big carriers. AT&T and Verizon domestically in the U.S. Carry the majority of traffic. So you could have argued years ago, my goodness, what's going to happen? Concentrating all of this network activity into a couple of companies, is that going to be a problem? I would argue it hasn't been. I would argue that that's actually turned out to be a pretty good story. So the question of, will we be concentrating too much risk in a handful of carriers? I think it'll be a long tail sort of thing where you'll have a handful that carry the predominant load. And also, by the way, probably have the biggest teams and the biggest security infrastructure, and probably have the most availability of excellent tools, for account management, role-based access, logging, auditing, alarming, that kind of thing. And then a long tail of other as-a-service capabilities that may be more niche, might have less security infrastructure. And if you're inclined to scatter your risk, like if you're the type of person who puts their money in 20 different banks, then you might like to put your data in 20 different cloud systems. But I think most people will be comfortable with a handful of industry leaders and connecting them up via CASBs and into their SIM and so on. I think it'd be a pretty good architecture.
I would imagine that we probably will see an uptick in crisis management or some type of incident response scenario-based tests to make sure that if small, medium, or large companies are having that concentrated risk, it would probably behoove them to test out if all their data and eggs are in one basket, what do they do in the event that they can't get to that information? So as we move into 2018, that might be something that the companies need to start looking heavily into, where they have a cyber storm using the cloud environment if they haven't already done so.
Wow, I wish they would. That's such a great idea. I mean, there's very, very few companies and government agencies that do what you just described. I mean, that is absolute best practice. I know prevalent. I know you guys support that sort of thing. I think that's as good as it gets. So to the degree that we see more companies doing that, actually running through disaster scenarios and testing, man, that's how you do cybersecurity. Like I said, I wish more companies would do that. I think some companies maybe nibble at the edges of that. But to do it right, and again, you guys are experts at this, to do it right takes some time. It takes planning, it takes budget, it takes experts, it takes the determination to actually force yourself to do it according to a carefully planned periodic schedule where you do it and you practice and you make sure that you have your disaster planning and incident response properly laid out. A problem we've had in our industry is that incident response for many years it was a phrase people used to use called the 51st job, meaning I've got 50 different things I do, and now you're going to pile incident response on me too.
Yeah.
And it becomes the 51st thing you do, and you hope you never have to do it. And when you do get the call on a Tuesday night or a Sunday morning or whatever, you grudgingly get on the bridge. All right, what happened? And you wish you didn't have to be there. You don't want to be there. You've got 50 other things you'd rather be doing. That has been the problem. I think many companies, many of the better companies, have flipped that on its head and said, wait a minute, this is not your 51st job. It beats your first job. We need a team that can really manage to emergencies and manage to incidents and actually incent them in their performance reviews to do it right and not to worry about false positives. When was the last time a fire department worried about false positives? When the alarm goes off, you go. And if there's no fire, then that's good news. That's not bad news. That's good news. That they're nothing up in flames, but you have to respond. You have to be incented to that. So I do hope more companies start moving in that direction. That would be a healthy trend for our industry.
It's funny that you talk about the Sundays or the Tuesday incident response calls at the wee hours of the morning. At a company I worked for, we had very intelligent cyber hunters. And for some reason, they always found something on a Friday night. So I wanted to take their computer away from them to say, please don't call me on Friday night. But it just seems to happen on holidays and the weekends. It's really interesting.
That's so funny.
So I think we want to move to the next topic here around IoT. We're hitting kind of the major topics coming into 2018 from a cybersecurity perspective, and IoT seems to be a topic on everybody's mind. People are talking about it. I think there's a lot of confusion, but the Internet of Things for biomedical devices, automotive, other IoT-related sectors, even IoT, for consumer use, seems to be driving some significant risk. What do you think those risk identifiers are, and what do you think is important for us to think about?
Well, you're right that this is a big area. And you know what it reminds me of? It reminds me of the 90s when most companies were running a Novell NetWare IPX LAN. And to get out onto the Internet, you had to do some sort of tunneling or translation of the IPX protocol out onto the Internet. And you had some safety in the sense that your network was running something that wasn't directly in band with the Internet. This was, again, in the late 80s, early 90s. I think Novell probably had 75% of the market. Well, now in IT/OT, we have something similar, where there's that IT/OT gateway, where on the left side, the IT side, you've got all the traditional IT management tools and monitoring and enterprise capability that we're all pretty familiar with. Windows systems sitting on Ethernets, running IP stacks. But to the right of that gateway, you have this OT infrastructure, typically SCADA controlled, and it's a range of all kinds of crazy things, ranging from, say, whimsical stuff like the appliances in your home, like in a connected home, to much more serious equipment, electromechanical systems in a nuclear power plant, or wind turbines, or actuators in some important factory infrastructure. All of those things typically are sitting on a network that's not exactly in band with the IT network. There's that IT/OT gateway. I think just as NetWare, unfortunately, kind of went away, I always thought that was good software. I think that OT SCADA out-of-band thing is also going to melt away. And you're going to see most future OT systems designed using conventional technology. It's cheaper, it's easier to manage, and that IT/OT gateway is just going to gradually become a router. And then what will happen is all these OT devices and IoT devices are going to be in band with scanners sitting on the public internet. So I'm a little worried about that. I'm not convinced that that's such a great thing from a security perspective. I get that that's the industry's direction because it just makes things simpler. But I prefer to think that the aircraft parts on an engine, on an airplane that I'm flying to San Francisco, I'd like to think that those parts are not directly accessible by some kid sitting on the internet with a scanner. I think that is true today. I worry that moving forward that may not be true. So we need to be careful. We need to be aware of the risk, and aware that as we shift the architecture toward more in-band, reachable connectivity, that we really do ratchet up the risk pretty considerably. Like I think all of us remember what happened once local area networks became inbound with the internet. That was the end of the perimeter. It just dissolved. It was too much. It was like a gush of water bursting through all the windows and doors in your home, and suddenly the whole house is flooded. I feel like the same thing is going to happen in an OT SCADA-controlled network. So hate to be negative. I'm just saying that's one where we need to be aware of the risk. And, there are a lot of techniques and tools that we can use to try to mitigate that risk.
It's interesting as you're speaking. I was able to. I was speaking at a conference, and the gentleman right after me was a professor at University of California, who I guess about 5 or 6 years ago ran a project with his graduate students to actually hack some GM cars. And what's so interesting about it is there's been a tremendous amount of work on this, but even today they are able to actually get into some of the modems. Each car seemingly has a phone number you can dial into. And I think they did a 60-minute piece on this where they were able to dial into some of these cars that the journalists were driving in and effectively stop them, right? And because the OEMs don't own a lot of this technology, they're integrators effectively. Managing all the components becomes really hard from, just the exponential growth of the device, the software, and, frankly, just the management of bringing all of this together seems like the complexity of it is overwhelming for those organizations that are trying to manage it. How do you think having a standard here is going to help in the security of this? And also, do you think that counterbalances the innovation that's necessary to continue to drive this forward to help, ultimately with autonomous vehicles and solving a lot of medical issues and the things that this is really helping trying to solve and drive for? It seems like there's a big balance there, right?
Well, you raise a lot of different issues there. I mean, on connected cars specifically, things are getting better. You just do not have, a CAN bus sitting there wide open, accessible from the internet with, simple lateral traversal across the bus from like the entertainment system to the braking system. Car companies are not that dumb anymore. They just don't do that. Second, the test that you refer to, Charlie Miller and partner doing a live test on a freeway, I didn't approve of that at all. I think it could have been done on a track, right? Could have gone to a racetrack under controlled conditions, driven the car around the track and demonstrated the same thing, but they did it on a live St. Louis freeway. And I was furious because my graduate students look up to those guys. And I do not think hacking live infrastructure on a live freeway is ethically acceptable. I don't know anybody who, when they take a moment to think about the fact that there could have been a mom in a minivan in front of that car that they were goofing around with, with a bunch of kids in the car who might have gotten frightened and might have been in an accident. So I'd be very careful about hacking live OT devices like cars. Now, you mentioned autonomous. Autonomous is an incredibly interesting area from a cybersecurity perspective because it implies that a piece of computing equipment will be self-protecting and self-determining and will make decisions using AI and other things about such as it introduces really, really fascinating questions like the manufacturer, for example, might embed into an autonomous vehicle certain values and belief structures that are never violated, where you say, look, I am the parent manufacturer. I'm going to push this autonomous vehicle out. As you make decisions based on your environment autonomously, here are the things we never violate. Like you've heard the famous discussions if an autonomous vehicle sees that there are two conditions, one where maybe X number of people could be harmed or damaged, and the other where Y less than X could be harmed or damaged, you have to make that moral decision. It's really interesting questions for computer scientists once you start introducing autonomy. But all of these things require care and consideration. And, I'm about college professors, a lot of university students that that I coach, and I always tell them that, the faster you go, the more likely it is that you're going to be making mistakes. And as we engineer into areas in OT and IoT where there's safety and life-critical issues, I really do think you have to slow down a little bit, make sure you get the engineering right. We're all in such a spectacular rush. That's been the history of technology the last, say, 50 years since we invented software engineering. Just an incredible rush. We even call software development a sprint now, right? In DevOps, everybody's in such a rush that is going to come back to get us. You got to slow down when you're designing for a 2-ton vehicle that's going to be traveling at 80 miles an hour down a freeway with a bunch of kids in it. I think you have to do the engineering right. So that's what I've been preaching. Slow down, get it right, and in the long run, it'll advance and support that industry, that autonomous machine and connected car industry, much better than this business of rushing through adding new features.
So I'm going to still have to drive my kids around for a while, huh?
I don't think it's going to hold back the availability of autonomous systems. When I say slow down, I just mean, take the time to engineer cybersecurity and controls and safety and economy of design and simplicity of function into the vehicle. And rather than have all these flashy things, less is more, right? I mean, any engineer, anybody writing software, I'm just going to sound a little funny, and I hope I don't offend anybody, but anybody who's been doing it long enough, like if you've been doing it for 20 or 30 years, eventually it comes to you that less is more in software. It's a weird concept because we always count lines of code for productivity. But when you have experience as a software engineer, you realize, wow, less is more. Simple is better. Economy is power, not the reverse, like adding more, throwing more in. Whenever I see a system that involves whipping more functions and this and that and bells and whistles in to accomplish, say, some security objective, I always make a face and say, I don't think that's right. Show me how you're taking something out, and then I'm happy. And I think in OT and connected cars and autonomous machines, simplicity and economy are the way to go. That's how you secure those things, not by adding a bunch of functions.
It's so interesting. This came up as a topic, and what was extraordinarily interesting to me was that a lot of the systems that are being put into these cars do a lot of, they have a lot of functions, right? The controllers do a lot of things. They can manage a lot of the systems. And what the integrators do, and the car manufacturers do especially, is they limit those functions. And what the hackers are doing is they're really focusing on how to open those up. And it's really a balancing act of how do you secure it, because the manufacturers need something that's going to provide a multitude of different functions based on use cases that they haven't derived and identified yet, and they need to do something that's broadly acceptable. And then the manufacturers want to limit that, but the goal has been to unlimit those controllers. And so it's an interesting third-party risk, supply chain management, software security question that I think you're right. It's going to take a little time to make sure we understand it better.
I like what Ed is talking about with regards to making sure that they slow down and the engineers put in the right controls in place, because you would think that with automation, there always has to be some kind of, for lack of better words, a manual kill switch, so that we would be able to go back to manual. So it's not like your daughters or your children or your sons are going to grow up and not have to drive at all. They're going to have some kinds of capabilities, hopefully, that they're taught, that as they get into the future of all these neat things, that they still have the ability to have some type of control in case something happens, where we can do that kill switch and manually go into action.
Well, Ed talked about some of these ethical issues. I mean, one of the things that you ask yourself is, I think in California, they actually identified the computer as the driver for situations. If you think about some of these autonomous vehicles are supposed to help people who may be infirm, right? Maybe they're older, they can't drive themselves. So in that situation, giving them control wouldn't work. And so they really do have to have full autonomy, or maybe somebody who's been drinking, or whatever. Yeah, there's a lot of thought that I think we need to dig in. Maybe for another podcast, I don't know.
If you do the math on, in the connected car context, I don't have the exact number. Tell me if this sounds right. I think it's something like 30,000 people killed in highway accidents in our country each year, something like that, some terrible number. And with fully connected infrastructure, where we're all doing that as the primary means of transportation, you got to believe that's going to drop 90% or more.
Right.
So there's no question that from that perspective, the whole thing is much better. But to the question of manual kill switch, and I'm an old ops guy, so I'm an old manual kill switch guy. I have my whole career. For 34 years, I always ask, where's the red button? Because that's just the way I grew up. So I'm with you totally on that. The problem is once you cross that Rubicon, once everything is automated, things are happening too quickly for there to be a manual control switch.
Right.
I mean, you want to be able to monitor. But it's sort of like, I know this weird analogy, but it's like when you have a bunch of kids and suddenly your kids outnumber you, the game changes, right? Like it's easy to manage one or two kids. Try 7 or 8, it's a different game. So I think automation is like that too, where you could always sort of sit with that red button and watch, and if things get out of hand, you reach out, you hit the red button, and we're good. But in a fully autonomous AI-type controlled environment, where, say, an aircraft is pulling telemetry and it notices something inbound, like let's say, another aircraft or something that's flying in the way, but a pack of geese or something, a human being can't respond quickly enough, but computers can. And in that sense, I think we need to sort of balance that, the red button, with automating that red button and learning to be comfortable that the braking system is going to stop the car with your teenager in it better than your teenager probably would have noticed as a human being. It's a different concept. I'm in my mid-50s, so I'm still getting used to that. I didn't grow up with that. I think that my kids, and certainly their kids, are going to be 100% comfortable with that. In fact, they'll pretty regularly reference the fact that human beings are inferior to machines in making snap judgments about safety. So that's going to be a big change, and for the better. You won't have 30,000 deaths. You'll have something way less. You could argue almost nil. It's possible. That would be a great goal.
So another area of concern that we saw in 2017 and before was application security. This is an area that we need to focus risk more in because some of the less mature security vectors aren't really looking at defect management on the applications. So where do you see improvements in risk that our communities should refocus on in the application space?
Yeah, application security, and I know you guys know a lot about this as well. It's all over the map, right? So let's start at the beginning. Software and software engineering is still so darn new in the context of other types of engineering that it doesn't surprise me that we can't build systems that are bug-free. We just can't. We can't build a non-trivial system that is devoid of sometimes spectacular errors. The best developers, under the best conditions, building software that still kind of stinks. And when you're doing third party, as again you guys are experts at, wow, you have a real problem, because a lot of times as you move down the supply chain, you're not dealing with the best developers. You could be dealing with quite mediocre developers, which just makes things worse. So before you even start into how you deal with application security issues with functionality and procedures and so on and tools, we all have to recognize that the root cause here of application security problems is bad software engineering, and that'll take time. Even computer science is not a science. Like if you have to call yourself a science, you are not one. So computer science has no repeatability, no laws, no anything. It's just still fledgling. It's like astrology and numerology and alchemy all wrapped up into one. That's what computer science is right now. We haven't figured out how to pull astronomy and mathematics and chemistry out of that yet. We're still figuring that out. Now, what that means in practice is that you have to assume that any software you didn't write yourself, and even if you wrote it yourself, it's flawed, but you have to assume that any application is flawed. And the question then becomes, how do you manage the risk? And there's a range of things. Like some people like the idea of process maturity. So they'll want to know, instead of, taking your blood to see if you have a disease, tell me all the places you've been. Tell me how you live your life, and I'll indirectly make assumptions about your code. That's how process maturity works. Like, there are these standards that pop up. My friend Gary McGraw worked for many years on something called BSIM, and there's others. So you can do process maturity. So that's one. Second is scanning. That's the most popular because that's an easy thing to buy from a vendor, point at some application, and look for problems. And it's a wonderful tool. I'm not saying it's bad. I'm just saying it's been around for a while, and it will detect what it can detect, and that can be done either statically, or you can do it somewhat dynamically. The third is behavioral analytics, where you take the application, you whip it into a sandbox, some safe place where you can detonate the thing, and you jumble it around a little bit and see what happens. See if it's making calls out, see if it's spitting out your private information, see if it's doing this, that, or the other thing, and make some determination about that. And it goes on and on and on. There's runtime application security protection, like RASP, where you embed controls directly into the application. It's like you wire these hooks right into the app so I can pull telemetry as it's running from the inside and really get a good picture for whether inappropriate system calls are being made or whether some sort of weird memory operations are being attempted. There's a whole set of heuristics around that. So it goes on and on and on and on. Even the machine learning folks have gotten into the game of, showing bad pieces of application code to a training engine. So instead of here's a picture of a cat, here's a picture of a cat, here's a picture of a cat, now go detect cats, you can do the same thing. Like here's some crappy code, here's some crappy code, here's some crappy code, now go look for crappy code. So it's across the board. So naturally, when you're running an enterprise security team, this is a difficult area. I've said over and over again in my writings and teachings and speeches and all the work that I do at Tag Cyber, I've said over and over again that I believe application security may be saved for third-party risk. I think third-party risk really is the biggest problem everybody deals with day in, day out, and I know you guys know that. But I would put application security very close, if not even maybe a close second. And it's the root of most problems. Poorly coded apps that misbehave, that misfire, that are easily exploited, and that compromise data. That's the root cause of a lot of different problems. So you can see you have to fix software engineering, you have to improve process, you have to improve scanning, you have to improve behavioral analytics, you have to improve the AI work, you have to improve RASP. All of those things together have to get better over time, and that'll raise the low water mark. But until then, it's a tough area, very hard to manage, very hard to find people who are experienced. And, I hate to paint a bleak picture there. Hopefully I'm painting some silver lining into each of these areas as well. But it is a tough area. I know you guys know a lot about that area.
One of the things that I was intrigued by, I think last week, Google announced that as part of their AI initiative, they actually had their AI brain actually help in the development of a new AI. I don't know if you had read that, where they saw improvements in a lot of the software that the actual computer had developed independent of some humans. Do you think application security only gets better once we start removing the human element?
No, I don't. I don't. And all that stuff from Google and all the stuff you hear some of these guys like Elon Musk and others say about AI, I think is a bunch of nonsense, frankly. Like, to be perfectly honest with you, I think that AI is, in some sense, the alchemy of computer science. So humanoid kinds of things where the AI teaches itself to build new AI and eventually takes over, and, all these social issues emerge. I don't agree with any of that. I think that that's it's just they're just mistaken. And I know these are smart people, but remember Isaac Newton, in between doing calculus and physics, was an alchemist mixing potions, trying to make alchemy.
Right.
It's not that dumb people are tricked into this, but artificial intelligence is not, thought, and it's not. And I read a lot of that stuff, and it looks like public relations hyperbole, tech hyperbole to me. I just don't agree with any of it. I think that these are beautiful algorithms, and the idea of labeling objects and training something based on labeled examples to recognize and extrapolate to some new situations is a logical progression from Donald Knuth's primitives in his volumes, sorting, searching, matching. We know how to do that. Now we know how to label, and we know how to train. Those are good primitives in computer science. But all that stuff from these tech companies on the West Coast, I think that's their PR teams trying to look hip. I do not agree with that stuff. I think that they're wrong. Now, that said, you do need human beings who learn to code properly, and it has to be based on science. Like if you go back years, in the 60s and 70s, Edgar Dijkstra, probably the greatest computer scientist who ever lived, and I do use the word scientist there because he was a scientist, and he was trying to build laws and principles so that what he would refer to computer science as is computing. It's a computing as a science. It has to have repeatability, and he would do all this mathematics and show how you can repeat things. I can put assertions in place and repeat, writing code and maintaining stuff, blah, 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 blah. Those are human activities by human engineers based on scientific principles. That's what we need at the root. Now, once we build these things, I'm all in favor of autonomy. I'm all in favor of machine learning. I love that stuff. I think it's fantastic, and it's the right direction for computing. But it's not going to be taking humans out, again, in the context of application security. The real key, ironically, unlike in autonomous and some other areas, the ironic thing, I believe, in application security is that is where the humans play the primary role. That's where humans build very simple, clean tools. One point, and then I'm rambling on, but this is an important point. When I began my career, I had the opportunity to work in Bell Laboratories and kind of rub up against some of the great masters who were building software tools in the context of Unix. I spent the first 10 years of my career kind of working in and around Unix security. And one of the things that we always learned from, great masters like Dennis Ritchie and others was that you build a simple thing, you make it do one thing, and you just resist the temptation to introduce anything other than what's essential for that one simple thing. And you obsess on making certain that it's correct and that it's clean and that it's elegant. And once it is, you call it a tool and you make it available. And then that tool never has to be redone again because it was done properly by a human being and made available as a toolkit. That's how Unix emerged. That's why Unix is so powerful. An operating system built when Lyndon Johnson was the president is the basis for everything that you use today, from Apple and Google and everywhere else. They're all built on the basic principles of Unix. Again, Lyndon Johnson, president 50 years ago, they got it right. They built simple, elegant things that do one thing, nothing more. It's a human decision, and it really has a power of exponentiation, as we've seen. So I do think application security will be dependent on software engineering discipline being improved by human beings. I spend a lot of time on that.
Ed, that sounds fantastic. We're running out of time here. So I guess just wrapping up, it sounds like even across the three areas we discussed, cloud security, IoT, application security. So if we're going to take one lesson from the things, I mean, the resounding, commentary sounds like it's keep it simple. Drive simplicity into the process and clean engineering. And, a lot of the things that we take for granted, keep it simple, make sure it works right. And we're going to drive security into these areas.
You've been at this a long time. I would imagine you'd probably say the same thing, right? The simpler the better. Right?
I totally agree, and we actually talk a lot about that. You know, the key controls we've been talking about for 20 years. It's those key 20 or so controls that solve 80% of the issues, right?
I think that's right.
So I really would like to thank you, Ed, for joining us on our podcast today. Really appreciate it.
Well, my pleasure.
Thank you for listening to the Prevalent Risk Governance Podcast. Connect with us on Twitter, Facebook, and visit us at prevalent.net. You can also rate and review the show on Apple Podcasts.